there's one thing that I want to mention in your book that really helped. Actually, it was your whole book that really helped me because as a preacher, I regularly, obviously, deal with the Sermon on the Mount. And
Hmm.
in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus very clearly, well, it might not be very clear if you're reading certain English translations,
Hmm.
but Jesus very clearly articulates an emanation theory of sight.
Oh yeah, right, right.
And so, and for years, okay, I'm preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, I'm going through, and then you hit that passage, and it's like, now what do I do with this? Because, I am, and this again is one of these instances where I'm so steeped in the in the materialist worldview, even though I'm sort of in portions of myself trying to break out of it and resisting it. And
Right.
you come across this verse where Jesus is very clearly articulating, and then I read in my commentaries, well, this is one theory about, the emanation, theory of sight, and here Jesus uses that. But then suddenly I have to sort of then start Christological issues come up, and I mean all sorts of issues come up, and it's like, and then I've got to present this in the context of a sermon where the vast majority of people are just trying to maybe, but they don't even know what synthesis they're working on in order to make sense of life. And they're just looking for some little tidbit that will help them in some way, maybe somehow, Pastor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this book sort of just kind of takes that and says, and I think this is where your title is at, and it's sort of the main thesis of the book is that seeing is not what you think it is.
Totally. Well, it's funny you were asking earlier about the origins of this book in my personal history, like where did I start thinking about this stuff? And that part of the book is the oldest part of the book in
Hmm.
my journey. I actually at in grad school I ran a little, it wasn't a church, a home church exactly, but it was like a weekly meeting to talk about a Bible passage, and we worked through various different books of the Bible. Um, and it was exactly in arriving at that passage and being like, oh wait, what do we think about, like, what did Jesus think about extramission and intromission, and did he just kind of take the common whatever? So I went on this whole rabbit hole into Al-Haytham, who shows up in the book, and all these the history of the science of optics, which is a relatively late kind of development
Yes.
among the basic facts of science, like the discovery that light comes into the eyes definitively is as a relatively late discovery, precisely for this reason that even though it is true that physical light enters our physical eyes, we all know that we sense that we do something to the stuff that comes in, that we don't just have what Henry James, or rather William James, called a blooming, buzzing confusion. It's sort of filtered through our consciousness. Um, and maybe, who knows, there was a time when we were infants when the world was much more kind of just a barrage of sense impressions. But at all the points that we can remember, the world is organized, and light that comes into our eyes is also shaped almost involuntarily into form and into color and all of these things that don't have any real existence except as perceived. Um, and in fact, if you think your way into a state of mind that is pre modern science, and that is not obsessed with nailing down, you know, the geometric kind of dimensions of the material world, but is actually trying to describe in a more holistic way what's going on. And then you read a text like Plato's Timaeus, which is way earlier than the Gospels, but where we find a very clear sort of description of this extramission theory, the idea that the fire comes out of the eyes. And if you think, well, okay, so maybe Plato's actually not trying to do the same thing that like a modern optician is trying to do. Maybe he's trying to describe in his classic sort of metaphorical, mythological language what sight is. And if you read it that way, it's actually an extremely profound text. It says basically that the gods created the world imbued with fire, that there's fire all throughout the air, and that our eyes have what Timaeus calls a twin flame within them, that there's something analogous, or there's some kind of answering twin in us, in our mind, that is out there in the world. And when these two things meet, that is the mode of perception that we call sight, Timaeus says. And taken as a physical statement, that is false. And so when it became the case that only physical statements could be true, people decided, well, Plato was totally wrong about sight. But it's very possible that Plato had no intention of presenting it as a physical theory of what sight is, or if he did, it was only because he was interested in how that physical mechanism sort of embodied a much more profound spiritual inner invisible truth, which is that when the world meets our perception and our consciousness, there's a kind of um, union between two things that are similar to one another but different. That they're similar in form but different in identity. And then you get this like explosion. And that's still true. I mean, even if you now kind of translate all this into neurology and you say, well, photons hit our rods and cones and the brain performs something, 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 like a series of operations that is still completely opaque, even to our best neurologists, but like transforms those geometric motions into what we call sight. We're still basically saying that the light of the eyes meets the light of the world. We're just not saying it in the same kind of physicalized terms that Plato was talking about. So what does this all mean for the Sermon on the Mount? Well, I mean, I actually have no idea what Jesus thought about like photons. I genuinely, I don't think he deigned to inform us, and and I feel like he didn't stutter. So if he didn't think it was important to inform us, then I guess it's not really important for me to know. Um, it's possible that it's possible for me to conceive that in the limitations of his humanity, like while he consented to be embodied and live a human life, that included limitations on his material knowledge, such that he basically believed what everybody around him believed about light. It's also possible if I imagine myself into that for a second, it matters to me not at all because what he's saying in that passage is take this image, like think of your eye as a lamp illuminating the whole body. And now understand that if that light goes dark, everything within you and outside of you goes dark. That like your mode of perception transforms the world. And that is still 110% true, whether or not Jesus thought he was using a real description of light, or whether like God had given him a preview of Newtonian optics. Like also totally possible to me. But it sort of like sidesteps the whole question, which I think is kind of helpful because that's not really the question that we want. We don't want to be tangled up in that question when we're coming to the Gospels. We want, as you say, to get some kind of insight into how we can live fully. Um, and usually, I think the obsession that we have with physicalist accuracy is like a bit of a red herring, distracting from that.
Well, and I think McGilchrist is super helpful with that. That there's a part of us really wants that emissarian accounting. But
Hmm.
the deeper question is, which I think you really get at towards the end of the book, why do we want that emissarian accounting? And the why is because and I think you really nailed it well in the book is that and this goes all the way back to Genesis. The why is because we really hope that God can be done away with
Yeah.
so that we will mount his throne, so that we will I mean there's a motivational problem that we have. And even, just as for us to get at, okay, so what did Plato want? Well, in some sense, he probably wanted the same thing that we all want,
Right. Right.
but none of us are very clear on exactly what that is. I mean, clearly there's part of us that wants mastery and domination, and we're these tiny egoists that really want to have everything at the expense of we don't care. Um,
Yeah.
but and so then yeah, that No, I think you again. This is why again I think your book is so important and so well done. And I am already emotionally prepared for my frustration that it won't get the kind of credit or visibility your book deserves because I really think it is that good and that important